I simply cannot find her.
Maria?
She's missing from the Abbey again.
Perhaps we should have put a cowbell around her neck.
I have looked everywhere, in all of the usual places.
There is a moment from the filming of one of the most beloved movies in history that the studio worked very hard to make sure you never found out about. Not a rumor, not a tabloid story. A real documented moment that happened on a real set, witnessed by real crew members, and then quietly buried for decades. What makes it even more remarkable is that the scene it happened on is probably one you have watched more than once. You may have even called it romantic. But before we get there, you need to understand how this film almost never happened at all. Because the road that led to the Sound of Music reaching cinemas was so chaotic, so filled with wrong turns and last-minute decisions, that it is genuinely surprising the movie exists in the form we know it today. It started in Europe in the mid-1950s, when a pair of German-language films based on the real story of the Von Trapp family quietly found massive audiences across West Germany and parts of South America. These were modest productions, low budgets, sentimental storytelling, the kind of films that would not look out of place on a Sunday afternoon television slot. But they touched something real in audiences who were still recovering emotionally from the war. A story about a musical family choosing love and freedom over fear? That landed hard in post-war Europe. When those films were eventually shown to American studios, the reaction was closer to polite confusion than excitement. Hollywood looked at the material and saw something too soft, too foreign, too theatrical for the tastes of the American movie-going public. Nobody wanted to touch it. Nobody, that is, except a stage director named Vincent Donahue, who had just won a Tony Award and had the kind of eye that sees potential where other people see problems. He watched those German films, and beneath all the rough edges, he caught something nobody else had noticed. The story had real emotional weight, and he had one idea that changed everything. He said the story should not be a film at all. It should be a Broadway musical, and it should be built around one of the biggest stars the American stage had ever seen. That suggestion set off a chain of events that would ultimately produce one of the highest-grossing films in the entire history of cinema. But getting there required one of the strangest business deals ever made in show business. Maria Von Trapp, the real woman at the center of the story, had already sold the rights to her life for a one-time payment that, even by the standards of the time, was shockingly small. She had no agents, no lawyers advising her, no real understanding of what those rights might eventually be worth. She simply needed money for her family and said yes to the first reasonable offer she received. What she signed away that day would later generate hundreds of millions of dollars, and she would see almost none of it. When Broadway producers eventually tracked her down to ask for her blessing on a stage version, they had to chase her across the world. She was doing missionary work in the jungles of Papua New Guinea, completely off the grid, receiving mail only occasionally at remote outposts. When letters from a couple in America started arriving, asking her to consider a Broadway production, she tore them up without opening most of them. She was not interested in entertainment. She was interested in the people she was serving. The breakthrough only happened because of a chance encounter at a San Francisco pier. When Maria finally returned to the United States, a persistent producer was waiting for her at the dock. He handed her tickets to see his wife perform on stage. Maria went, probably out of politeness more than genuine interest. What she saw stopped her cold. The performance was so electric, so genuinely moving, that she walked out of that theater with a completely different attitude. She still could not offer the full rights. Those were long gone. But she gave a quiet, casual green light that made everything possible. The stage musical that followed was built by two of the greatest songwriters the American theater has ever produced. And the songs they created were not arrangements of old folk melodies or traditional Austrian tunes, as the original concept had planned. They were entirely original compositions, written from scratch, and several of them have since become so embedded in popular culture that people around the world hum them, without knowing where they came from. That musical ran on Broadway for nearly 4 years. It was a phenomenon before Hollywood even came calling. When the film rights finally went up for sale, studios fought hard for them. The winning bid came from a studio that was, at the time, in serious financial trouble. Their previous blockbuster had gone so far over budget, that it had nearly destroyed the company entirely. Buying an expensive stage musical adaptation was a gamble that many industry insiders considered reckless. There was even a clause buried in the contract that everyone laughed at, a profit-sharing arrangement that would kick in if the film ever crossed a certain earnings threshold. One of the original writers literally chuckled when he heard the number. He genuinely did not believe the movie would get anywhere close to it. He was spectacularly wrong. Before the film could be made, it needed two things above everything else: the right director and the right lead actress. Getting both of those turned out to be far more complicated than anyone expected. The actress who eventually played Maria had, just before landing the role, been passed over for the film version of another enormously successful Broadway show she had starred in for years. The studio making that picture decided she was not glamorous enough for the screen. They chose a bigger name instead, a genuinely iconic actress, but one who could not sing the role, and had to have her vocals replaced entirely. The rejection stung deeply. It was the kind of professional wound that lingers. Then, a director working on a completely different film happened to see some early footage of a Disney picture she had made. He was not fully convinced she was right for his project, but something about those few minutes of film settled the question instantly. He turned to the person sitting next to him and said they needed to sign her before anyone else had the chance. She was offered a flat fee for her work, a decent sum, but with no share of future profits, no bonuses tied to performance, no back-end arrangement of any kind. She accepted and delivered what became arguably the defining performance of her generation. When the film went on to earn staggering sums around the world, she did not receive a single additional dollar beyond what had already been agreed. The actor cast opposite her had an entirely different problem. He did not want the role at all. He found the material too sweet, too sentimental, too far from the serious dramatic work he wanted to be known for. He turned it down more than once. The director eventually flew to London specifically to persuade him in person, and even then, the actor only agreed on the condition that the character be substantially rewritten. He wanted more depth, more conflict, more genuine emotional range. He pushed for a song that would give the captain a moment of quiet vulnerability, something that felt personal rather than theatrical. That request shaped one of the film's most remembered musical moments. But even after agreeing, he struggled throughout production. He later admitted openly that he found the work difficult in ways that went beyond the professional. He drank heavily during the shoot. Some scenes were filmed while he was, by his own account, not entirely sober. One of them, the scene that audiences most often point to as the emotional heart of his performance, was filmed on a day when he was in no condition to be working at all. And yet what ended up on screen moved audiences to tears for decades. That is either a testament to the man's raw talent or to the strange alchemy that sometimes happens between a camera and a performer, even under the worst possible circumstances. There was also the matter of his voice. The singing you hear from his character in the film is not entirely his. A professional vocalist stepped in for the more demanding passages, blending so seamlessly with the actor's own delivery that even dedicated fans of the film rarely noticed. When the actor discovered the extent of this, he was furious. He felt it undercut everything he had worked to bring to the role. But the producers had made their decision. The film was already in production, and there was little he could do. He spent years afterward barely able to mention the film without visible irritation. It took a very long time, and the overwhelming weight of the film's cultural legacy, for him to make peace with the whole experience. Now, the gazebo. Here is what actually happened during the filming of the romantic scene that generations of viewers have sighed over. The crew had set up large industrial arc lights to simulate soft moonlight falling across the gazebo. These were not subtle pieces of equipment. They were heavy, powerful machines that ran hot and made a considerable amount of noise. And the noise they made was not a gentle hum. It was a sound that, if you heard it without context, you would immediately recognize as something embarrassing. Every time the two lead actors moved close together for the scene, the lights produced this noise. Loud and unmistakable. They tried to film the scene more than 20 times. Every single attempt collapsed into laughter before it could be completed. The crew could not hold it together. The actors could not hold it together. Even the most straightforward lines of dialogue became impossible to deliver because the moment they got close enough to each other, the lights would go off again. Hours passed. Nothing worked. The director eventually abandoned the original plan entirely. He scrapped the lighting setup, repositioned the actors in front of the glowing windows of the gazebo structure, and shot the whole scene in silhouette. Their faces were mostly hidden. Their expressions were invisible. And that decision, made entirely out of desperation, produced one of the most visually distinctive and genuinely romantic shots in the film. The soft glow, the shadows, the restrained elegance of the framing, none of it was planned. All of it was damage control. The studio made sure none of this became public knowledge. Cast and crew were told in no uncertain terms that the story was not to leave the set. For years, fans watching that scene had no idea that the dreamy visual style they were admiring had been invented on the spot to solve a problem nobody was willing to explain. The truth only came out much later, when the lead actress finally told the story on a television program, laughing as she described trying to maintain composure while industrial equipment made sounds that had no place in a love scene. The chaos was not limited to that one moment. Filming on location in Austria was supposed to take 6 weeks. It took nearly twice that long. The weather that year was among the worst the region had seen in a long time, and rain delays stacked up week after week. Hundreds of crew members sat idle in wet clothes, burning through a budget that the studio could not easily absorb. Executives back home were receiving daily updates that made the whole project look increasingly like a disaster in slow motion. Physical danger was also part of the production. During a scene involving a boat on a lake, a young child in the cast who could not swim ended up in the water when the sequence did not go as planned. The adult actor who was supposed to be close enough to help was knocked in the wrong direction when the boat went over. The child slipped under the surface twice before someone else managed to reach her. She swallowed enough water to make her sick and developed a fear of swimming that stayed with her for years afterward. The lead actress called it one of the most frightening moments she experienced during the entire production. The opening shot of the film, the one that has become so iconic it is practically synonymous with the movie itself, came with its own physical cost. Getting the sweeping aerial perspective required a helicopter to fly extremely low over the actress as she stood in a meadow. The rotor wash from the blades was powerful enough to knock her off her feet repeatedly. She was flattened into the grass again and again, had to stand back up, compose herself, and be ready for the next pass. She joked afterward that she had been essentially tackled from the air multiple times in order to produce 30 seconds of footage that looks completely effortless. And then there is the director who never made the film at all. A highly respected filmmaker had been attached to the project from early in development. He had even stepped down from a board position at the studio to avoid any conflict of interest. He looked, from the outside, like the committed choice. But privately, he had serious doubts from the beginning. The material did not speak to him. The songs felt disconnected from the story in ways he could not resolve. His hearing was deteriorating, which made directing a musical even more demanding than it would normally be. He began quietly looking for a way out. The exit came when he was offered a very different kind of project, something darker, more psychological, more aligned with the kind of filmmaker he actually wanted to be. He asked to be released from his commitment. The official story given to the press was a scheduling conflict. The reality was that he simply ran in the opposite direction as fast as he reasonably could. The director who stepped in to replace him took the project from that uncertain starting point and turned it into the most commercially successful film of its decade. By the time the film had been in release for 18 months, it had done something that almost no one in Hollywood had believed was possible. It had overtaken the single most profitable movie in the history of the medium up to that point, a film that had sat at the top of the box office rankings for nearly 30 years. The Sound of Music sold more tickets than almost any film before it. People who did not speak English were humming its melodies. Families went back to see it multiple times. It won 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. And the clause in the contract that everyone had laughed at, the profit-sharing threshold that no one believed would ever be reached, was crossed so far in the rear-view mirror that the laughter must have felt very different by then. What is strange, when you sit with all of this, is how much of what people love about the film came from things going wrong. The most iconic shot required someone to be knocked down over and over. The most romantic scene was filmed in silhouette because the original lighting was making everyone laugh too hard to work. The most emotionally affecting performance was delivered by an actor who resented being there. The best remembered song was written specifically to give that reluctant actor something to connect with, because nothing else in the script was reaching him. Every film has a gap between how it looks finished and what it took to make it. Most of the time, that gap is just inconvenient. Sometimes, as with this one, the gap is so wide and so filled with strange, human, messy reality that the finished product almost seems like a miracle. Not because it is perfect, but because it exists at all. And because so much of what makes it work came not from careful planning, but from people improvising their way through situations nobody had prepared for. The scenes you were never supposed to know about are not dark secrets. They are just the truth of what it looks like to make something that lasts. And the fact that the studio tried so hard for so long to keep that truth hidden says more about Hollywood's relationship with its own mythology than it does about the film itself. Some things, it turns out, are more interesting when you know the whole story.